Good evening or good afternoon or even good morning, everybody. I'm Meg Malone, the director of the Center for Assessment Research and Development here at ACTFL, and thank you for coming to our webinar. All right, I'm going to go forward and introduce our presenter, Dr. Julie Sykes, who received her PhD from the University of Minnesota, is an associate professor of linguistics and the director of the Center for Applied Second Language Studies at the University of Oregon. Even more importantly to us at ACTFL, she is the editor of our flagship journal, which we affectionately refer to as Flannels. Dr. Sykes will give a presentation, and then I will help facilitate the Q&A, and we really look forward to this. Thank you so much for coming, and Julie, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, and hello everyone. It's delightful to see so many people here on this webinar, again, likely at all different times of day from all over the world. So we're really excited to have you, and I look forward to having this sort of conversation, at least hopefully through Q&A with you. I'll try to pause some as we go, but mostly we'll address those questions at the end, just to make sure we have plenty of time. The presentation component is about 20 minutes or so, hopefully with some real practical tips and some anecdotes, at least from my own life. I have a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old also at home with me, and so we've definitely been navigating different waters here the last few weeks around research and all of the pieces that we're doing. So ideas here, tips, strategies, support, lessons learned. The idea is to really make sure you have the resources that you need in order to tailor some of that discussion, even though we have lots of us. I would like to offer a question for you all here. And I'll give you a spot in just a minute to answer it, but what do you find to be the most challenging aspect of your research during this time? I'll just give everyone a few minutes and we get close to the 250 or so mark. Expected, we're right in the middle. So it looks like we really are split down the middle. So many of those challenges, right, being how do we start new projects under the current ambiguity really of what's happening? How do we continue to collect data and work on possibly projects that we've been working on for a long time, finding time to write and really fitting that in with a number of additional teaching and maybe research responsibilities, and then getting the support maybe that we're used to having on campus. Also some notes just about collecting the data in the environment in which we're working. And so hopefully we address all of these. Certainly in 20 minutes, we're not going to get to every single one, but it gives you a sense kind of the challenges we're facing as researchers in this space. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and really dive in. I just want to remind us as we are talking about all of these things is that all of us are experiencing what's happening in the pandemic differently. Many of the tips, of course, are intended to fit any context, but also can be adapted, right? It might be that you have this really colorful computer, it's exciting, there are colors and markers and all kinds of things happening at once, or crazy hair day is still happening with an online Zoom class. It might be there are kind of dirty dishes and you squeeze in work 10 minutes at a time wherever you can. It might be though that you go in a car because the only place there's Wi-Fi is to sit outside of a coffee shop that might have it, or a public building, but you can't go in. And so many hours spent sitting in those places trying some connectivity, or lots and lots of people in one small space working on how to connect that way. And so any of the work we do has to consider that human component. And so I just don't want to forget that as we dive into these tips and tricks as we go. So the first one is giving yourself permission to adapt and modify. It becomes fundamentally critical to say, well, I had this protocol written, I've asked for funding to do this project, but based on many conditions out of my control, I'm going to have to adapt and modify. And in my experience, both with funders as well as project review boards or different advisory boards, most people are very, very open to that modification, especially when you've thought through how that works with your particular research project. 3 particular areas around study design that might require modification, both in terms of if you're starting a new research project, as well as having to sort of switch to that project on the fly. One is thinking about your research site and how you might be able to adapt something like classroom observations into either video classroom observations or even data analysis from learning management system, or LMS is what I put on the slide there. The data on the back end of how people are engaging, who's engaging with that work. And so while it certainly probably was not your original intention, there becomes a point where it's okay to say, actually, I need to switch this up. And I need to just say, like, here's what I knew before, here's what half of my data says, and here's what the other half says, or wherever you kind of are in that project. Likewise, as you start to plan new study designs, thinking about, well, I need to think about whatever one of these research sites most effectively fits the questions that I'm wanting to ask. Also thinking about your means of analysis and the need likely for using mixed method approaches, especially if you're having to adapt on the fly. You might have a strong quantitative protocol that you're working with, but you just can't get enough data to make that work. And so there's a way to supplement some of that with using other types of rigorous qualitative methodology or mixed method approaches to the data that you already have. Also really thinking about collaborative research, and maybe there's a colleague somewhere who's been working on similar questions, and yes, you have 2 different sites and some of those variables don't match perfectly, but they do sort of complement each other and give you ways to analyze, and again, adapting to what your original intention was. Finally, open data sets and working with any sort of data that might be out there, especially those of you who are worried about any sort of data collection in the fall, really want to get some writing out, really want to get some analysis out, saying, well, what do we already have that still can be worked with, you still can work with. And so there are a number of resources available, and I'll mention a couple here later around open data sets. I'd also encourage seasoned researchers who have data. Many of us have data out there that we just will never get to in a lifetime. We either move on to another project or try something, and really opening up that data for analysis, especially thinking through human subjects and anonymizing that data before making it available, but allowing those pieces. And as we're writing new protocols, ensuring the data can become open and kind of work in that way. Finally, I really encourage you to expand your literature review, especially now interdisciplinary becomes more key. Not that it hasn't been previously, right? But the idea that the more we tread into uncharted territory around the number of people learning and teaching remotely and online, the context under which everyone is learning and teaching, especially languages, really drawing on fields we may not typically draw on for world language research can be really, really helpful. Things we already know about online communication that transfer really well to our understanding of world language or multilingualism in digital environments, and how that changes in compared to what we're used to when we're talking about especially classroom interaction in world language classrooms. Also, what we know now about language learning may or may not apply. And so really encouraging us in those study designs to kind of test our intuition and question them. Even people who've been researching in these areas for a long time, we know everything is changing. And so it gives us lots of research questions and things that we can figure out specifically around how interaction, how multilingualism, and how learning and teaching can happen in these online spaces. Also, in terms of data collection, just some suggestions from moving from face-to-face to online, or somewhere in between, or somewhere not even close. There are lots of different contexts we're talking about, of course, around the world, but generally some ways you might originally have planned to do classroom observation, right? That is not possible anymore, with many schools no longer in session or occurring. And so a couple of alternatives, maybe a combination of these 4, maybe just saying, well, I'm only going to do one, or I'm going to take this part out of my protocol. Again, the adaptation and modification, right? One is asking for online classroom observation. I know some of us are leery about sort of adding additional pressure to those classrooms, understandably so, but even asking the question, one nice piece about the Zoom environment or any other sort of digital conference environment is you can hide much more easily than you can actually in a face-to-face classroom as a researcher, which allows you to observe some of the things that might be going on in terms of the learning. And always being cautious just that those aren't evaluative of what's happening in terms of quality of instruction or things that are shared for merit, things like that, but rather as researchers, that's what we're there, is just figuring out what's happening. Also, the analysis of data from online courses, we automatically have a whole bunch of data we didn't have before on how learners complete activities, how they engage with different activities, time spent online. And so that can be a modification you can build into some of your research protocols as well. Also, home observation. In some cases, people have had the opportunity to come in and say, hey, do you mind if I watch you do this activity with your child? Not every parent, of course, or every family is open to that, but some really are. And some are looking for something different anyway to mix up the monotony. And so not being afraid to ask, of course, carefully and politely without being pushy, but that can be another place you can get some of that. And then maybe canceling that classroom observation. Maybe it's just not an option right now, and thinking of alternative ways to work on that particular data. Second, in terms of interviews, not be afraid to go to video conference interviews or phone calls. Something I've found, especially with more shy interviewees, is they actually prefer a phone call without seeing us face to face, and that's absolutely fine, right? Hey, let's jump on a call while you're taking a walk, and I want you to tell me what your experience has been like. And so not being afraid, again, to ask. I think something that we worry about, and I think understandably so, me included, is, well, I don't want to take more time. It's already stressful enough. Absolutely. Asking cautiously, but also sometimes people are looking for some kind of different connection than what we're seeing. Surveys can very much say the same. These days, most surveys are electronic anyway. The one difference might be if you're working with young learners where you have them circle pictures, do things like that. There are many programs now that offer online availability of those protocols that even smaller children can work with. I'll even tell you what I've seen in the kindergarten, first grade, and second grade, because I spend a lot of time there on a personal side of my life, is they're often better at much of this stuff very quickly. They don't know right away, but my 6-year-old was just teaching my dad how to change his virtual background on his Zoom call and how to screenshot and share privately and chat. And so they learn very quickly how to do these things. And then finally, in terms of evaluation instruments, opportunities to create an online replica of what you might have someone do by hand. You'll, of course, have to acknowledge that there might be differences there, both in terms of the cognitive overload processing and what happens there, but also being able to compare that to previous research can be helpful as we think about replication as well. Also, you can mail those instruments if you really want them done by hand, mailing them to participants or sending digitally to print. Again, being cautious of equity options and giving people the option. I can either mail it to you, I can put it in an envelope on your door, or I can send it to you digitally to print. What do you prefer? And letting them sort of make that call can also be really helpful. And just some ideas then for modifying that data collection as you dive into your research protocols, especially those of you who are right in the middle of big research projects. I know that was the case for us. We have a big project going on right now, and we had to switch all of our protocols onto a digital format. Finally, in terms of writing and implications, 4 tips or suggestions that I have is, 1, write what you see in the data. So even if it's really different, even if it tells you that everything is sort of falling apart, understanding what you see in that data and helping us understand what's going on can be really, really valuable in the research scenario. I think something that many of us in the field have been talking about a lot is the need to report on and publish imperfect data and imperfect protocols, not in the sense of lowered rigor, but in the sense of we need to report what actually happens in the complex reality of classrooms and home environments, and how does that then impact the language learning process and what's happening in those spaces. Also consider in your writing, especially in your analysis component, how the implications of your results apply to the current context, not just when you started the project. It can be a temptation to say, here's my analysis, and here's what it means when we get back to normal. I think what we're seeing is that classroom environments already are shifting pretty drastically, and even just the way we understand learning has shifted based on the last 8 weeks. And so really considering that and taking that in as part of your research can be really, really helpful. Again, I mentioned this previously, but what literature helps me understand my data? Maybe there's a whole bunch of literature that we've never considered in a field, depending on what your research questions are, especially around virtual learning, around things that might be outside of world languages specifically, but really close to learning science and data sciences. Also, if you have before and after data, meaning you have half of a data set from before everyone went remote and after data, don't be afraid to talk about that and what are the differences and what do those look like. And again, a very neutral research approach can be helpful in understanding what to do with that particular data. The second tip that I have is collaborate and communicate. The more time everyone spends in their stay at home or sheltered spaces, again, every context is different, even more this week probably than was true 2 weeks ago. And so not being afraid to reach out and say, oh, I could just ask someone this question. We'll see when they get back to me. I need to be patient. But building that network and that collaboration, especially around shifts in your human subjects protocol, for example. Our research office at Oregon has been amazing in saying, file this as an amendment, but you only need to file this as an event. And just really paying attention to what those options are in the research space. And so I made a list of some key collaborators. Some of you probably already know this. Some of you might hopefully look at this list and say, oh, I should reach out to them. Oh, I've been meaning to do that for a long time. So the second tip is saying, hey, ask someone what their ideas might be about sort of some of these shifts, or even brainstorming with you. Do you know of an app that does this? Or do you have an idea about how I might be able to do this? Colleagues, Office of Research, Open Data Resource Administrators, Institutional Review Board, Department Chair, Dean, Mentors. I'm sure we could make a list of 20 more different types of collaborators, but a reminder that that becomes really critical, especially in this time of research in COVID, because naturally you're sort of siloed in different spaces, and we're also tired, right? Many people are on Zoom calls for hours and hours a day, and so the idea of another meeting sometimes feels daunting, but maybe it's just a text conversation, or maybe it's a chat conversation or an email that really facilitates that particular collaboration. Finally, my last tip is find what works for you, and the most important part of this is stick to it. I think one of the hardest things, especially with the amazing educators and researchers I get the privilege to work with, is we all stretch ourselves too thin, and I know I'm absolutely guilty of this. And as we stretch ourselves too thin, we realize, wait, I had a plan, and now I'm just human capacity has extended my ability to follow that plan. And so to give you one example I've been really working on in my own life is give myself 24 hours before I say yes to anything new. So my natural response is always, yes, of course I want to do that. It's interesting. I want to help. I want to be there. But I know that eventually you run out of time. And so really saying, you know what, I'm really interested. Give me 24 hours to think about it. And that gives me a chance to come back. But there are a million different ways that everyone will address that. Two things to think about in that way. One is probably a new workflow for many of you that might mean you have lots of other people at home, whether you have children or not, you are at home or you're by yourself, whatever that context is, it changes the workflow, both in terms of time, focus, and value. So in terms of time, my advice is a small block each day. I know we've all heard that for a long time. And by a small block, I actually mean 15 minutes. If that's all you can manage, 15 minutes every day is better than 0 minutes and wishing you would have done 2 hours. Often that 15 minutes turns into more time, or maybe it's 3 15-minute connections, but whatever that looks like, something small, and just sticking to that. And do not schedule over it. No matter what, at all costs, 15 minutes can give you a space just to say, you know, I found 3 references today, and that means I got to work on my research. Also focus. Pick your time that's most productive. Many of these we've heard before, but also that's realistic. In my case, early mornings are nice, but if someone wakes up early, there goes my most productive time. And so I want to use that, and often it might be, hey, hold on one sec, why don't you sit here and read next to me while I do this 15 minutes? Things like that. Also, pick a place that works for you and go there each day, and pick research tasks that fit your capacity. If we saw that long list in that survey and that poll, you saw there's a whole bunch of things associated with research, not just writing. And so if writing that day really is beyond sort of your focus and capacity, even brainstorming new research questions or thinking about what this looks like long-term can still keep you on track for thinking about it. Also, allow yourself to do less if you need to, or do more if you need to, and communicate those needs and respect the needs of others. It's really easy, I think, to place value on a certain way of being in certain times. And so I would really encourage us as a research field to say, let's support one another where everyone is in this time of COVID. And it becomes really important, especially of you who might be seasoned researchers who have a lot of space, to say, hey, can I grab this and do some reference checks for you? Or hey, can I support you in these different ways? Especially for junior scholars who are admittedly looking towards tenure or looking towards other more full-time employments that require publication. There's a lot of space there to communicate those needs and respect those of others. Finally, design and communicate a realistic plan. And I want to encourage all of you to write this down. The actual versus perceived reality of what you can do. I can tell you this has been remarkably helpful. What do you think you can do is often sometimes more than you can, but really thinking about, okay, this is my plan, and then communicating it and summarizing it with the people who it most relates to. If you decide to extend your tenure clock, for example, for a year, which many universities are offering, talking with your chair, talking with your dean and saying, this is what I'd like to do, this is how I'm going to do it, this is what happens, and then just summarizing that in writing, then gives you the permission to actually follow through and say, well, I don't have to take the, no, just take the year, that was your decision, and then giving yourself permission to do that. And so those kind of 3 tips, both from the nitty-gritty of the research to the collaboration and to the decisions about work and how you want to work together, hopefully come together to create a space to really make your research productive during this time. I do want to lead us into questions with 3 really key points for reflection. One is that a human-centered approach to research will yield quality research results with fewer mistakes. So essentially, this is a call to action for all of us working in this field that says quality over quantity, or quality maybe in conjunction with quality, but really thinking about the researchers and you all as researchers and writers as human in the space that you work. And so allowing you the space to do that work while also then following through on the responsibilities of the plans we set for ourselves. I encourage all of us to take that approach to get better research out in the field. Also, we have that responsibility then for creating it through mentorship, self-reflection, and we get the choice to do that. And sometimes pandemics or other major life events allow for kind of a shift and a recentering. And so in our research area, we can also really think through how that works. Finally, the questions that are coming are already here in terms of research questions, can and should inform the research choices we make in the future. We really can be leaders in that endeavor as world language educators. We know a lot about how humans interact in different contexts, how we learn different languages, learn to adapt, and ambiguity and risk-taking. And so it's exciting to see what type of research is going to come out of certainly conditions that none of us planned for or expected for. And so with that, I do want to talk about 2 things really quickly. Review for relief, those of you who are looking for and have time, really using our time as researchers to tangibly give back. And we will donate $75 to COVID relief for every FLA completed. This is just for the month of May as we, and it was for April as well, as we work through making sure everyone both has the time to do what they need to do, but also getting research through the pipeline. Also, the IRIS digital repository and instruments, there are lots of options there for those analysis materials and instrument materials and open data as you're looking for modifications for your own research. And so there are 2 kind of tangible things that are happening. We want to ask you one more question and then open it up to your more specific questions here. But as we're moving forward, are there other things that would would be more helpful for you, or resources that would be helpful for you as you keep working on your research through 2020. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll one more time, give you all a chance to answer. Also, again, if you answer the other, it would be great to type that in the Q&A box so we can compile those. Really, the goal is to offer as many resources as we can. And for me, both as a researcher and working on my own research profile, as well as an editor of the journal, we want to be able to offer as much support and mentorship as we can in these spaces. Alrighty, there we go. You can see those results. All right, thank you so much. There's a pretty clear consensus there. We'll see what we can do in that area, but we're really curious about the resources people were looking for. I definitely understand too much going on, so share in that for sure. With that, at this time, we'd like to open it up to questions that you all have and answer as many of them as we can going forward here. And Meg, I think you're going to direct some of those questions or summarize, right?
Yes, I just showed up to say hi to everybody. And I just want to start with a clarification question, which was, what do you mean by human-centered?
What do I mean by human-centered? I mean that we think of ourselves as people and that have lives, that work in universities and work really hard at the jobs that we do, but also have many, many other roles. And everyone has different roles that aren't just researcher. And so when we put people at the center of that, to give you a tangible example, if someone writes to me as editor and says, hey, I really need another 3 weeks to complete this manuscript, my response almost always is absolutely. The goal is to give people space to do high quality work without having to impede or sort of hurt the human health of what's happening in our field. So avoiding burnout would be another way, another factor sort of directly related to that.
Thank you so much. So one question that came up was, how would you word a grant proposal with a deadline coming soon for data that's planned for the fall, but we're not going to know if the research site is going to be available, and thus what is going to be doable? So what would you do with that? Is it okay to submit a proposal based on best case scenario in the face of uncertainty, or what would you recommend?
I think my recommendation is to submit 2 scenarios. Very clearly that both scenarios have been thought out. One is, if we're able to get into a face-to-face research site, it will look like this. If not, this is exactly what the protocol will look like. So some of those alternatives I talked about as part of tip 1, just building those in right from the front end can be really helpful. And I think will show, I mean, of course, it depends on where the grant is going and who the funder is, but it can be really helpful for them to see like, oh, they've really thought through the context. It's going to work either way and it's going to be feasible. I think one danger of doing only one best case scenario is we've all seen what happens when that doesn't happen, and funders might be leery of saying, well, if that doesn't happen, then what happens to the money, or where does it go? And so ensuring you have a backup plan for both of those can be it would add strength to your proposal for sure.
Great. Thank you, Julie. One question, I finished my dissertation in 2016, but I never published it. Is it too late to publish it?
Hard to know what the questions are. I would say no, probably not. Absolutely. Depending on what your research questions are, what the findings are, it's more about how relevant is it to the field and what has been done since. And so you'll have to, of course, go back and say, well, how does this data work and how does it relate to what's been published since? But I would really encourage you to dive in and do that and get that data out there, because any analysis, the more information we have, the better off we are.
So can you give this person 2 tips for how to get started?
2 tips on how to get started. One, I would say pick one research question and think of that as your publication, not your entire dissertation. So what would be the most interesting finding? What is the most interesting data? And start there. Something that Flannels does that we have that I really like, this was started, I believe, by the previous editor, but are challenge statements that say, here's a challenge in the field and here's how my research question addresses it. And that would be a way, how do I apply this to my own data? So that one piece. The second would be taking your dissertation apart and either cutting it apart physically, if that's how you think, or highlighting it or doing it online that says, this is the part that's relevant to a future publication and that's it. And really being ruthless about what you cut. One thing about publishing dissertations is often you want to keep everything in there because we have so much detail, but really the opposite is what we're looking at.
Thank you so much. Another question. I didn't know it was possible to hide while observing in Zoom or other online video conference platforms. Do you know if that's available on most video conference platforms?
It is. And what I mean by hide there is not that you don't show up as a square, but rather you can mute your video and mute your microphone. And most of the time it's either on a second screen, and it's much less obvious. Of course, people have to know there's an observer there, but it's much less obvious than someone additional sitting in a classroom, for example, taking notes. So that's what I mean by hide. You can't actually see a call. For example, you can see here in our video window, you probably don't know who's behind that ACTFL logo, or you probably maybe even didn't notice it other than a facilitation window until we kept going. So that's sort of what I mean by hide.
Another question for you. What do you hope to see in submissions for Flannels in the next 18 months?
I really hope to see work that is both responsive to the context we're in, and comparative in the sense of comparing different methods of what's happening in the online or remote or hybrid space, not necessarily comparing to what it used to be like. I think because as we move forward, we're going to need a strategic response in the field to world languages, and data can be really helpful in figuring that out. Specifically, if I think of a topic like how do you build community, there's a ton of work on how to build community in online courses, but I'm interested in work that would say, well, how do you build community in novice, intermediate, and advanced level courses? Do the same techniques work across each of these different courses? Why? What is the teacher role? There's just so much work there in terms of observation and analysis that can be helpful. Also moving away from purely perception work. So while surveys are really helpful when you add it in as part of mixed methods, they aren't necessarily helpful in determining user behavior. So if you ask, for example, I'll just use my kids because that's on my brain at the moment, but if you ask them how much they love their online work, they're going to tell you they hate it every time, but they always complete it, it's done, it's quality. And so those perceptions and the behaviors can be positive and not match, and those kinds of things. So just being cautious of that as people work on their own research. That's not to say perception work isn't important. It's how does it fit into a bigger context? I'm also really looking for work that addresses the key challenges, both in terms of policy, advocacy, teacher training, and retention. I think any of those major sort of priorities, I know they're also part of ACTFL's research priorities, but it's what people are talking about and looking for. Also proficiency-based approaches or content-based approaches, and work on how that builds different types of abilities in world languages can be really helpful.
Oh, this is a great question. I mean, they're all great questions, but this is a great one for you to answer in terms of submitting a journal article. Is there a call for publications coming up soon that focuses on the use of technology inside the classroom?
Well, there's not a new call coming out, although we will welcome one. If there's more research coming up, then we'll absolutely put out a new call. It's not a bad idea. There's actually the next issue of Foreign Language Annals, which will come out about 3 weeks from now, maybe 4, is a direct response to the crisis in technology and world language learning. And so we have articles that were already submitted to Foreign Language Annals, as well as 15 experts who've written, research experts who've done research synthesis of major issues in language learning and teaching and technology. So those will all come out in the next issue, the summer issue. I guess that's a little summer issue 2020. But yes, there's definitely always a call for that kind of work in connecting them together. I think if we do, the next issue will be related to different particular contexts, different levels of learning, those kind of pieces.
But we don't have a specific call for papers. People can just submit at any time.
No, yeah, people can just submit as they go. And yeah, and it will go right through the pipeline. So.
Oh. Any advice for dissertation writers at the last stages of writing? I mean completing the writing, the findings, the discussion parts.
Well, my first piece of advice, and this is what I tell my students, and then I'll get back to something more practical. Make sure you take off 24 hours every 7 days. Give yourself 24 hours of no dissertation work, no matter how frantic you feel, because you need that to clear your head in order to get a 30,000-foot view of your data and your implications, which have to come up in your discussion and findings section. It's also when you tend to be the most tired, is at the end of writing your dissertation. So just giving yourself that 24 hours can be really helpful. That being said, a more practical suggestion in terms of the actual writing piece is to create a map where you think about your major results and your research questions, and then giving yourself, literally drawing, what are the implications of this to teaching or to learning, whatever sort of your dissertation looks like, and making yourself write one of those threads every 2 days. So saying, I'm just going to work on this particular section and this, and that keeps a coherent thread then back to your literature review and your methodology, because you're not trying to do the whole thing all at once. And so the more you're able to outline, in my case, my brain kind of works like a drawing or a mind map, but at some, it might be an outline, it might be an Excel spreadsheet, whatever sort of keeps that pathway. Here's my research question, here are the results, and here are the implications. Here's how this ties back to previous work. And doing one of those kind of threads each couple days can be a really helpful way to just keep you going. A big piece at the end of your final stages is just finishing, right? And making yourself kind of go through those steps.
Great. The next one. As an editor, what advice would you give authors who have part of a research project completed and have to halt it because of the current COVID-19? What would you do?
If I can't adapt and it's impossible, I would probably just start a new project. Pause. I can tell you in our case, many of our research team have 2 or 3 projects going on at once, because although COVID absolutely has been one of the biggest upsets we've seen globally, there are things that happen to research projects all the time, right? A teacher gets sick, a classroom decides they change they change administrators and permissions change. And so any of those things, if you can find it in you to sort of think of how does this fit? What does that look like? What do you do with that? That can feel daunting, I think, to say like, whoa, I have to come up with a new idea right now. And the best advice I have when that feels overwhelming is say, well, what do you wonder about in your own life in terms of teaching and learning, right? What have you been thinking about? And is there work on that? And that curiosity can start to peak, which is really different than like, well, what's going to get published or what's the field going to say about it? And often when you work from that curiosity in your work, it comes through both in quality and in terms of the types of creative questions you're able to come up with.
Oh, I can't wait to hear your answer to this one. How do you respond or think about distinguishing between online teaching that will likely happen, that has happened now, or that will likely happen in the summer and fall, and what we just did in the second half of spring, which was more crisis management? So how do you think about how we can distinguish between planned online teaching and what we just did? Do you anticipate distinguishing between the two in future research and studies?
Yes, yes, and yes. I actually think of it in 3 phases, not 2, which makes probably laughing at me there. But I think the first phase is what we knew about online teaching pre-pandemic, right? Where we had courses that were really well planned, they were really well funded, they were strategic, they took sometimes up 3 years to work on and to develop. Then we have this crisis response in the last part of spring, many of which was sort of a face-to-face that went straight online. And then I see the third phase actually as post-pandemic online learning. I think we are understandably seeing learner fatigue in online environments that we didn't have in phase 1, right? So where we could build social engagements in some ways, and everything we know about online learning, this has been my research area, at least digital technologies and language learning for a long time. And I really think a lot of what we know in that research will have to be considered in light of, does it even still apply? So replication will be really, really important. Does what we know about online learning, do those studies, do those results still show up post-pandemic, even when we have time to plan or apply those same courses. I think the summer courses will still very much be some sort of crisis management. It takes some time to build a whole new course, as we know, but hopefully starting in the fall, we start to see kind of a rethinking of what teaching and learning looks like online. So I do think it's 3 different phases actually, and data comparing those will become really important.
Okay, take a breath. I have another PhD student. I've chosen a topic for my PhD, but with the pandemic, I got confused because I wanted to make it trendy and up to date, but I find it daunting. Any tips?
I think my biggest tip is to think about, I think I said this once before, but think about what you care about. When you're picking your PhD topic, it's the topic that you will work on when you are done working on it, right? Inevitably, by the end of your dissertation, you're saying like, I don't even care what the answers to this are. But then there's always an inkling, when you've picked the right topic, there's always an inkling of like, but I really want to know the answer. And so that becomes then your driving force in completing that research. So of course, picking something trendy or exciting under these conditions is important, but that doesn't last all the way through. So as you're sort of picking one, which inevitably is daunting, really think about what you think about, right? Care about what you want to learn more about, and then build your study based on that. Once you have your idea, my other piece of advice is cut it in half. Because usually it's too big for a dissertation. And so cut it in half and use the other half as the first 4 years of your research agenda. Should you choose to pursue a tenure track position, then you're set up to do kind of 2 stages of work as you go.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm gonna, some people are suggesting research ideas. Do you want to answer a few more questions and then I'll put some of those out there?
Yeah, that's great. And the more research ideas, the better. I think that's great for our field. And the more time we all have to talk and brainstorm about these pieces, the better off we are.
So one question I have, you touched on this a little bit in your presentation, but maybe a little more explicitly. How can researchers support each other in navigating these new waters of research right now?
I think one of the ways is we can actually brainstorm without judgment. So saying like, hey, I really need to dive into this new analysis method. And so sometimes I think in academia, we have a tendency to say like, well, didn't you learn this in grad school, or haven't you worked on these before? And so saying, well, yeah, but not for 5 years or 10 years. And so really spending some time with people, getting to just chat about ideas and brainstorm. I think that's one way to support. The other way is just spending 2 or 3 minutes talking with the people we work with about the context under which we're working. And so saying like, here's how my workflow works right now. In my case, right, I work 3 or 4 hours early in the morning before anyone wakes up. And then I'm pretty much out of pocket till people go to bed, or I'm available for things like email and meetings, but not really hardcore work. Can we work in together? And so with my co-authors, then what happens is I write in the morning and they write later, and then I write late. And so when you are really explicit about that, it helps people support one another as they get going. And the more we communicate about work styles and sort of our weaknesses without judgment, the better off we are at supporting each other, and the more high quality work we engage with.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much, Julie. How about maybe 1 or 2 more questions, and then I'll summarize some of the ideas, and then I have one final question for you, of course, for our.
All right, absolutely.
Okay. One question I have here is, as a researcher yourself, how do we move a project forward, a manuscript forward? You know, the project is done. When we have more obligations and less time?
Yeah, I think in that way, and this is not my idea. I learned this from the National Faculty Center, I think, on diversity. I'll have to look up the exact name. We'll post it with the webinar after this. I did a summer kind of boot camp that they offer on time management and working as sort of advanced career professionals. But it really is even if you say 100 words a day, right? I have 0 time, but I'm going to commit to 100 words a day. Inevitably, those 100 words they say 30 minutes a day. I think under pandemic conditions, it might need to be less, right? And so saying, if I can just squeeze out 100 words, I might get some oomph and keep writing, and I might not today. And that's okay, because I still wrote 100 words instead of sort of staring at this blank screen. And the other thing is just know you're not alone. Certainly that has been the case. It certainly was my case first when all of the pandemic stuff hit. It was, how do we even write under these conditions? And what does that look like in a field that needs support in a lot of different ways, right? And so I think, yeah, small chunks and smaller than you think. And sort of getting rid of this idea that we need 4 or 5 hours to really focus and dive into our writing, which eventually will be true as you probably polish that manuscript and work, but even getting words on the page can be really, really helpful.
Okay, as an editor, what tips do you give someone whose paper was rejected or needed to revise and resubmit?
My first tip, and this is what I tell my students and junior colleagues as well, is really try to shed the emotional reaction to that review as quickly as possible. I think it's really easy to get wrapped up in frustration and fear and worry about what that review or that rejection means long term and how it impacts your career. But the reality is, it's really an offer, especially a revise and resubmit, is really an offer to say, hey, here's a whole bunch of feedback to help you make this manuscript better. And hopefully the reviews that's not always true. In my case, I try to flag reviews that aren't this way and not help them, but hopefully they're kind and helpful and really dig into the issue. And so if you can shed that emotion around how you react to that review, it will help you deal with it more efficiently, and to not make it feel like such a chore to revise that manuscript. Also, my other piece of advice is to really go through that feedback and decide what applies and really apply critical thinking to it. You, of course, can't say, well, none of this is correct. The way I did it before was perfect. But you can say, well, this reviewer and this reviewer really disagree. And I then, as a scholar, need to make a decision about how to reconcile those two perspectives, not just to get it published, but to really think about then how my work fits in that field. So really walking through, again, I would say the more you can spread out that revision, so 1 or 2 comments a day versus trying to do that full revise and resubmit, can be also really helpful.
Yeah, so I've known Julie for about 6 or 7 years, and I wish I'd heard her say this about 10 years ago, because it would have made a huge difference.
I wish I would have applied it in my own life sooner as well, and I didn't. And I don't always get there, right? Sometimes things just happen and our capacity goes way out the window, but it's definitely better when you get that chance.
Yeah, I like the idea of getting 2 opposite points of view and having them meet. That's a really nice way of looking at it. So one more, so you're gonna answer one more piece of advice, then we're gonna wrap up some of the research ideas, and then I have a closing question for you, okay?
All right.
As a current grad student, what are your suggestions for getting published?
Submit early. I know that seems crazy, but I think as a grad student, we have this idea that has to be perfect before we submit. And of course, we want high quality submissions to the journal. But the reality is there's also humans on the other end, right? I'm human just like everyone else. The reviewers are human. Luke Plonsky, our managing editor, we're here, and our goal is to get good research out into the world. And so we really work with your mentor, of course, make sure they think it's a publishable paper, but really not being afraid to just press that submit button is so key. And then you learn through the process. Something we try to do often, and maybe we can do again more in these type of spaces, is sort of demystify that publication process. Because once you go through it a few times, it starts to feel manageable. But often I see graduate students, especially in their first couple of papers, just so afraid to submit that paper.
Definitely, yeah. The submit key is a big commitment, but it's not.
Big commitment, right? Someone else is going to judge and critique this work.
Right. Okay. So I have a few ideas for research that have come up, and these are so interesting. How do I conduct non-traditional tests in e-learning? That was first. I didn't make it first, Julie.
tips and best practices for teaching elementary Spanish, remote and online, narratives on student experience during this time. Do public schools need, if they need to stay online, what's the max caseload a world language teacher can handle? And where can we truly help a student learn a language, and where do we need to stop and slow down? What kind of LMS learning and teaching is most efficient for world languages? Explicit listening strategies and teaching listening comprehension. The most effective teaching methods for distance learning. Helping students with learning disabilities work and present a good research project. How online teaching evolves in if the post-pandemic phase only occurs 1 or 2 years later due to the persistent crisis. In addressing the environmental factors that intervene during online learning, like siblings or relatives. Let's see if there's anything else. Online teaching with comprehensible input through storytelling. And I think that's it. One other question, do you take publications from pre-K teachers or only those affiliated with universities? That was a soft one.
Absolutely, we take from pre-K teachers. I'm especially actually interested in research about young learners, as long as they meet the requirements of Foreign Language Annals, and there are a lot of detailed guideline submissions. So happy to answer questions about that or after you've reviewed online. But that's such a great.
Okay, you ready for your closing question, Julie?
All right, I'm ready.
All right. What do you hope we can say about ourselves as world language researchers when COVID-19 is in the rearview window?
Man, I hope we can look back and say we're proud of how we responded, both in terms as a community and as people who spend a lot of time thinking about humans and the way they interact with one another and the power that language plays in that, both in our L1, L2, L3. And I think as world language people, we're in a unique place to do that. And so I hope that really shines through when we look back at our research. And I think from a data and findings perspective, I'm really hopeful we can get an honest look about what can get better about teaching and learning, and what are we really, really good at. Both of those things coming through in the data and helping inform the decisions we make about education, at least for the next 3 or 4 or 5 years to come. And data can be really helpful in changing intuition and in really advocating for the best learning experience possible based on what we know, not based on what we think we know. And so I really hope that we can do that as a field.
Do you have any final thoughts?
I think my final thoughts are hang in there. I know that the energy to do this kind of work under these conditions is also really, really difficult to find. And if you have the ability to slow down, give yourself that permission. I think sometimes that's something we don't do. Also, if you don't have those conversations to say, I need to do something different here as we go through this. And most of all, congratulations on being here and spending time even this hour thinking about your research. And thank you for giving us your time, which I know for everyone right now is really, really precious. So thank you to Meg and the ACTFL team also for this opportunity to work with the journal, as well as all of you. So that's probably my concluding thoughts.
Thank you. Thank all of you for coming. I want to thank Kate, who facilitated this lovely online forum, and especially my wonderful colleague, Julie Sykes, who is not just the Foreign Language Annals editor, but also someone I do research with. And she does all those things. She really does. Like, she keeps you going. And she says things like, I'm going to need you to do this for me. And that's really helpful when you tell people what you need. So just think about what it is that you need. And thank you so much for coming. You're all just working under such difficult circumstances, and ACTFL is here for you. And thank you for everything you've been doing. And Julie, thank you.
Thank you all.